Well, Rod, thank you so much for helping my project. I normally ask people to introduce themselves, but I had a copy of your book here,
Oh,
and
good.
so I see you have the poster behind you. So,
Yes.
and
Very
then
nice of the publisher to send it to me.
also Ad Astra as well. So I
Yeah.
got
So Ad
published through Ad
Astra
Astra.
is the publication of the National Space Society, of which I am a member since 1984, because I'm old. And it's a quarterly, it's a print quarterly. And it's interesting. We just went back on the newsstands this year because we felt the message is so important. And a big part of that conversation in every issue is return to the moon. How are we going to do it? When are we going to do it? What hardware are we going to use? What are the political considerations? And as you know, it's a tough conversation, but I think it's a very necessary one. So even since I wrote Space 2.0, which came out in 2019, but I think I finished the manuscript in early 2018, so much has changed. It's like I need a second and third edition just to talk about what's happened with SpaceX, much less anybody else. So it's a really exciting time. And I just want to say, if you don't mind, I was born in the late 50s. So I was born about the same year as NASA was created. So I grew up seeing this stuff. I became aware of human spaceflight during the Gemini program when we were shooting up spacecraft every few weeks, achieving these big maneuvers that had to be done to prove we could go to the moon. So you had to be able to rendezvous, which hadn't been done before. You had to be able to dock, which hadn't been done before. You had to be able to test all these things, changing orbital orientation and so forth. And none of it had been done. So it was a really exciting time. And then to be alive during the Apollo moon program, when we were sending these incredible missions of exploration and discovery off to the moon as often as every 10 weeks was just stunning. And I was giving a talk to a bunch of young aerospace grad students a couple of years ago. It was a very small group, so it was kind of intimate. And I was talking about, I get very excited. I was going on and on about seeing these missions take off and people walking on the moon. It was so exciting and amazing. And one of the women in the front row started to sob. And I stopped and I said, "Did I say something wrong?" And she said, "No, but you have no idea how lucky you were to be alive then." And I thought, she's right. And for years, when I talked to groups like this, I would say, the new space age is coming. Just stand by. There's room for everybody. You're going to have jobs doing things you can't even imagine now. But until 2018, when the Falcon Heavy flew, I felt like that was kind of just a promise, and promises can be broken. But once Musk flew on his own dime, this mega rocket, which is the heaviest lift vehicle we have in the US inventory now, completely developed by this zany billionaire, I didn't feel like we had really arrived, but we're there now. And seeing NASA select SpaceX for the human landing system for the moon, regardless of how that contract works out, because we know there's some complaints about it from the other potential aerospace vendors. But just seeing that selection tells me that not only has private industry grown up to start filling this gap, but that NASA has come around under the leadership of Jim Bridenstine, I'll add. He was really the visionary to say, okay, this is clearly a cheaper way. We're going to do away with this old method that we had with the aerospace contractors. So, okay, we're hiring you. Here's the money. Let us know what the cost overruns are, and we'll pay everything. Now it's, here's the money, get it done. And if you can't meet those marks, you better have a darn good reason, or we're not going to pay you. And it's working. And it's really exciting. And it's working for about, even by NASA's own internal studies, which is remarkable, between a half and a tenth of what it would cost them to do it the old way.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Jim Bridenstine. He and I have two things in common. One, our enthusiasm for space exploration, and two, our birth year. So we both missed the Apollo program by about 3 years.
You have the same birth year in common?
Yeah.
Boy, politics must wear tough on a guy. You look a lot younger. Oops, I didn't say that.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. But I've been telling people that the 2020s are going to be what we thought the 1970s were going to be. And as somebody that lived through that time, does that resonate with you? What do you think?
Absolutely. So when I was in 8th grade, I won the science fair that year. That was my big achievement in middle school. And it was a survey of lunar cratering. But one of the prizes was a certificate to go buy books at the local bookstore. So I went and, because I was a true believer, I got nothing but science books. And one of them was a book called The Mars Project by Wernher von Braun. And it was written as an appendix to Wernher von Braun's only work of science fiction, which he wrote in the 40s while he was stuck at White Sands Missile Range doing tests with old V2s. And he was bored out of his mind. So he thought, oh, I'll write a science fiction novel. And it wasn't published till a few years ago. And there's a good reason for that, because it was terrible. It was bad. It was unreadable. But the appendix later was published in the early 50s as the Mars Project. And it lays out an entire program for getting to Mars, 10 ships, I think 7 were cargo and 3 were crew, if I remember correctly. And we were going to land on Mars with these big delta wing gliders. And then once you were down there for the better part of a year, you'd take the main fuselage of the glider and it would tilt up and take off as a rocket and all that. Well, as it turned out, we didn't know enough about Mars then. The solar system was a kinder, friendlier place in our minds before we started flying probes out there. And had he sent that mission out, it would have crashed and failed miserably. But at least somebody was thinking about it and somebody was doing this work. So then we come into the 60s, the space race is going like crazy. It's an arch competition, but as you know, between the US and the Soviet Union to see who can reach the moon first. And this wasn't for the glories of science or adventure. It was geopolitics. It was President Kennedy saying, look, we don't want to have a shooting war with you guys, but we're tired of having you try and monopolize the politics of the undecided world powers. You know, are they going to align with the Soviet Union or the US? So we're going to have this non-shooting competition on a technology basis. And what happened was it drew a very clear distinction between our methods of education and capitalism, of course, and industry to theirs. And the Soviets got very close. They could have probably, had they been willing to take the chance, they could have beaten us to at least loop the moon, but they didn't. And the US won the space race. So we were going great guns. Unfortunately, so about at that point, we were spending about 5% of the US federal budget on space, which was a lot. And there are a lot of people upset about it. There's this misperception that the United States was aligned and really enthusiastic about the Apollo program. And when it turns out, when you look at the polls, the public attitude was about 50-50, which it still is. So by 1965, 66, funds were being cut. By the 1970s, they had been cut dramatically. And Richard Nixon came into the White House and said quietly, I don't want this Democrat space program overriding my accomplishments. So let's look at something cheaper and reusable, which was the space shuttle. And of course, as we all know, the space shuttle never became that. It became a somewhat hobbled system that was a compromise of a bunch of design considerations and budget cuts. But it worked and it served us well for 30 years. But you're right, so much stuff that was going to happen went on the back burner. So for instance, when the people in the Apollo program working for NASA were looking at, okay, we've got this incredible capability. We've got this huge heavy lift rocket, still the biggest thing that's ever flown, most powerful. And we've got this very capable spacecraft and this lunar lander. What else can we do? They had permanent lunar module-based habitats they were going to put on the moon. They had lunar modules that were going to be on wheels that you could drive around in to explore better. So you actually had your pressurized habitat driving with you. They planned Apollo-based hardware missions to loop Venus and or Mars. One of them actually was going to have it loop both planets in the course of about 2 years, which would have been a long time in an Apollo capsule. They did have a habitat from an upper stage of Saturn they were going to attach, but that's still a long time to be in deep space in a small structure like that. It's about the size of Skylab. And then, of course, they had the human Mars landing program, which was being planned. So we had all these promises, all these promises of glory, if you will, of these amazing things we were going to do. And the science would be great. And the technology development would have been great. As we know, when you do human spaceflight, it's a huge driver for the technology base of that country that takes it on. That's why India and China are pursuing it so avidly now. They know that that develops young minds, people get engaged, all these innovations come out of it. And when you look at the returns, I could go through a whole long list of what came out of the Apollo program, but suffice it to say, for each dollar put in the money of the 60s, between $1 and $24 worth of value came back out. And that does not include education and soft innovation. So you could talk about Teflon and, you know, better pacemakers and MRIs and these things that came out of the Apollo program, at least arguably better computers, because the lunar module and command module computer system was the first portable integrated circuit computer ever designed. You could talk about those things all day, but the short version of this is it really pushes the nation. NASA at the time was an even larger investor in American education than the Department of Education was. So there are huge benefits, but we threw all that away for political reasons, not sound ones, to pursue the shuttle and to try and rein in this program. And the result was we stayed in orbit for over 30 years, and we're still in low Earth orbit, but at least we're planning to go back. What excites me now, as we talked about earlier, is these private individuals saying, look, I got a bunch of money. I grew up either during or just after the Apollo program. Those sounded like great years. We were doing really exciting stuff. I'll do it myself. And NASA, if you want to give me money, that's fine. If you don't, I'll do it anyway. And that's what guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are doing. So the opportunities, if you're a young person now, are so different. When I was coming up, going to college, you either work for NASA, the Department of Defense, or a contractor working for one of those two agencies. That was it. So you're either building NASA spaceships or weapon systems. Now, there are so many opportunities reaching down to companies that may only be 4 or 5 people. Even grad students are building satellites. What an incredible time. So I'm so excited for people that are coming up now. I'm a little envious, but I'm excited.
Well, you mentioned the downsizing of NASA after the budget cuts, and then we talk about kind of like the loss that we had in terms of space exploration development. But I also wonder if that's one of the positive legacies of the Apollo program, in the sense that we had all these engineers and people who were taking a technical, scientific approach to solving human problems. Suddenly, they're all throughout the economy, and the cost of an engineer went way down, and the availability of an engineer went way up. And now you had all these startups and other innovations and things. And if you had kept Apollo going, maybe we wouldn't have had those spinoffs to that degree.
Maybe. I mean, there's a dead period in there right after the late 60s where, and I remember this clearly reading articles in Time magazine and other media outlets at the time, that there were aerospace engineers working at car washes, donut shops. One was working at a leather tannery because that's the only work they could get. They had literally been thrown out when the program ended. NASA, just as governments will do, just said, okay, thanks for your service, see you around. And they were gone, and they had this incredible expertise. This is before globalization was really a thing, so they weren't going to go work for a foreign power building weapons or something. So that wasn't really a factor. But they got downscaled to the point that they were doing really non-engineering work just to support their families and stay alive. So I think for probably a decade, we lost a lot of technological capability. So it's really, I would say, the next generation that we benefited from, if those kids came up inspired by what their parents and uncles and aunts did. Sadly, in the 60s, the workforce was pretty homogenous. It was, younger white guys with skinny black ties and white shirts and short sleeves and pocket protectors and all that. And it didn't really get substantially integrated until the 70s and 80s. But you have a point. There was a kind of a training program there for excellence, but there was this gap. So for instance, when we decided to go back to Mars, so the first landers that successfully worked on Mars were the American Vikings in 1976. So we had orbiters, landers, went down, incredible development, real bargain for $1 billion, the whole program. Then in 1997, 21 years later, NASA JPL decides, okay, we're going back to Mars, the Mars Pathfinder, which was tiny. It was nothing compared. It was, the size of a small microwave compared to Viking, which was this monster. Didn't carry a lot of technology, but they needed to redefine some of the elements. So between the first and second set of rovers, they said, we really need throttleable engines that'll work on Mars. We had that for Viking. Let's just get those. Those people were gone, and there wasn't as much documentation as they needed. So they gathered everything they could, but a lot of that knowledge had been lost, and the skills have been lost from that set of engineers of that time. So they had to reinvent a lot of that, and that was quite costly. And we see that across the board. A few years ago, they finally closed down the remnants of the North American Aviation Plant in Southern California, which is where the Apollo command modules and the second stage of Saturn V were built, and the shuttle. Of course, they built all the shuttles. And I went down there and watched as, mountains of paperwork were just tossed in the dumpsters because NASA didn't have the money to save that stuff. So a lot of data was lost. Now, we'd like to think the important things were retained. They did have a knowledge retention officer overseeing this, NASA did, but a lot of that stuff got lost, and there was a lot of angst over that because you can't get that back. You have to do it again. So yeah, it's important to keep what you learn. So I think we did have a loss there, but we're coming back. And the good news is the private people like Musk and Bezos, but I think Musk foremost, he doesn't need a lot of that. He is building on the shoulders of giants, to use a cliche. So a lot of the heavy lifting in the early days was done by the US and the Soviet Union with big rockets and big rocket motors, and learning how to do this properly, learning how to rendezvous, how to dock, how to take off of the moon and so forth. So a lot of that work's been done once. And people like Musk are coming in and saying, okay, thanks for the knowledge. I'm going to build on top of that. And that's working really well. And the refinements that Musk alone has made in some of those areas, like methane fueled rocket engines that are truly reusable, spacecraft that are truly reusable. For God's sakes, learning how to fly a first stage back to the landing zone by itself. They're not controlling that thing. It just talks to the barge at the landing site, says, okay, where are you? What's the sea state? What speed am I going? Okay, I know how to land. That's incredible when you think about it. And it took them a lot of tries, but at least in SpaceX's part, unlike NASA, when NASA builds a system, they've got Congress watching, they've got taxpayers watching, and like we've seen with the SLS, Space Launch System, it goes very slowly. Everything has to be safe. Everything has to be perfect. And you want it to work the first time. Well, you've seen what SpaceX does. Let's fly it and see what happens. Oh, it exploded. Okay, gather the parts, do an analysis, do it again. So that fast iteration, fail forward mentality, which is kind of what the Germans did back in the 40s with the V2, really seems to work well. And we're seeing amazing things come out of it. And I'm tickled every time I see one of those launches. And the press drives me nuts because the story that night is always, Elon Musk blows up another rocket. What they're missing is that he's achieved 90 to 95% of his flight goals and gathered data right up till that point of landing when it blows up. And that's where the value is before that. And it's a success, whether it blows up or not.
Yeah, I mean, the big difference between that and all the other rockets is they didn't even bother to try to land them, So it's
Right.
like,
They just throw them away. And that gets really expensive. I mean, Musk and now NASA, I think Bill Nelson invoked this the other day, love to use the analogy of you wouldn't fly a 747 or now a 757, 787 to Europe and then get rid of the plane and build another one to come home. Well, yeah, that's a little disingenuous though, because flying sideways is a lot easier than flying straight up, right? That's a real challenge. And the stresses involved in going up to near orbit and coming back are tremendous. And we still see people experiencing failures. The Chinese, the recent launch of their modular space station, for the second time in a year, their first stage came back uncontrolled and tumbling and dumped itself, thankfully, into the ocean. It's still hard to do. But yeah, expendable is no longer the way to go, which is why a lot of people are still so frustrated with the SLS, because it's a throwaway rocket using shuttle technology from the 70s.
and it took what should have been easy to snap together, took a long time.
Yeah, and it's funny because it seems like it should have been really simple, right? They had a bunch of shuttle engines sitting around. They had the design of the external tank, which isn't one-to-one with the SLS core stage, but there's some similarities there. It's a different alloy now and different welding techniques and all that. But there's a lot of similarity in the bulk design of the thing. So you'd think we'd have that nailed. But the way Boeing's arrangements were with NASA, they weren't particularly incentivized to move quickly or on price. So yeah, it's gone very slowly, and we'll be lucky if we get the thing off in the early part of next year. So what's really weird is, so NASA was trying to pick a human landing system for the moon. And as I said, they're using this newer idea of, okay, we're going to go to these private companies, give them a fixed price bid and make them live with it. And so they put it out to bid. The first year, the 3 studies go out to SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Dynetics. And SpaceX, Blue Origin has a national team that includes Northrop Grumman and so forth, so there's a lot of lunar module legacy there. So that first year study goes by, they get prices back. Congress, it ends up not giving NASA nearly as much for the moon landing as they had asked for. I think they asked for, what was it, 3.2 billion and got less than $1 billion. They had 800 million. So NASA, quite understandably, just before Bill Nelson comes in on a very quiet late Friday press conference, so the timing was kind of interesting, says, okay, we're picking SpaceX only because that's all we can afford. And that makes a lot of sense, but a lot of people screamed and yelled. Congress wasn't happy, of course, because that means work out of their districts. But what really was fascinating to me is, I think when that first bid went out to those 3 companies, SpaceX was considered kind of a dark horse because the Starship was still not really flight worthy at that point. The tests were very preliminary, and it didn't make sense as a lunar landing vehicle, whereas now it's the prime choice. So you've got this weird thing because we have to fly the SLS. Congress has insisted on that. That's the law. You're going to put 3 astronauts or 4 astronauts on top of an SLS rocket, a little tiny Orion capsule, send that up to lunar orbit, either to the gateway or to lunar orbit to rendezvous with a starship, lunar starship. And then this huge spaceship is going to land these people on the moon. These guys are sitting up in the very top part of this, and they've got this RV sized space below them that'll be filled with air. So for the first couple of landings, it's very odd. And this also argues the case, of course, of Starship is designed to go from the Earth to the moon and back and land. They're just going to use it as a shuttle from lunar orbit back and forth and refuel it up there, presumably. I'm glad they're doing it because it's becoming proven technology, but it's odd to send a Toyota Yaris up to load up this semi-truck sized vehicle to take them down to the moon. But if it works, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I mean, I know the official plan is lunar rendezvous with the Orion, but it seems like probably a midterm plan would be Earth rendezvous with maybe, a Crew Dragon or, another Starship.
Yeah, because Starship, whatever they're going to land on the moon with, has to go out there anyway. So, and it's going to have life support systems in it anyway to take these people to the moon and back. So why not just fly a Falcon 9 or an Atlas or a Vulcan, whatever you're going to use? We want to spread the love around, up to orbit, rendezvous, and take them out in that. And then if you want to, once he's got the tech right, you can just bring them home, and you don't even need to rendezvous with an Orion or a Dragon when you get home. You just bring them down from orbit in that thing. But I think that's a bridge too far for NASA right now. There's a lot of political considerations. Fortunately for us, we had with Jim Bridenstine and now with Bill Nelson, two hard knuckle political brawlers in there, especially Nelson, who, when you have a former engineer or astronaut as the head of NASA, they know technology, but they don't necessarily know how to work Washington. These guys know where the skeletons are, And so when they need to make a deal, they can close the door and have a quiet conversation and get things done. And we haven't had an administrator like that since James Webb back in the Apollo days, who retired in 1968. And he's one of the only reasons I think Apollo was successful. So that gives me a lot of hope too, because these guys know how to make deals.
Definitely. Well, I normally ask people, did you know we were going to the moon, and how did you find out, and what it would take for more people to have? But I'd like to turn that question around totally and say, back when you were growing up, what would it have taken for people not to have known that we were going to the moon?
Well, if you lived in Russia, you had an idea that the America was going to the moon, but you were told that the Soviet Union was going to get there first and with greater glory. Because cosmonauts had bigger muscles and larger egos and all that. If you were listening to TOS, I think some of the aligned countries like Cuba and the North Korea of the time and so forth, a lot of the developing world didn't know much about it. But the lunar landing was watched by over 500 million people in the so-called free world of the time. And a lot more people heard on the radio and read about it in the paper. So if you were in a developed nation, especially a Western democracy, you really have to have your head buried under a pile of rocks to not know, because it was all the rage. Because remember, back in those days, well, you won't remember, but back in those days, we had 3 national TV networks. We had more national radio networks, but they were limited. And then we had, of course, local stations, and we had local and large market newspapers, and that was it. So the message was pretty controllable. So the people that ran NASA, the NASA Public Affairs Office, the PAO, could decide what they were going to send out to this select group of outlets, including Reuters and so forth, and then that would go out to the larger press. So they had a lot of control over that message. Now that's different. You've got thousands and thousands and thousands of outlets, both online and not, but mostly online, to the point that, dealing with SpaceX's communication department, they're very nice people, but it's a bit like dealing with the Soviet Union in the old days, where they tell you what they want to tell you, and then the rest of it they just don't, because they don't have to. They're not a publicly owned agency, right? So you've got this whole passel of people camped out in Boca Chica, Texas, looking through the fence every day with their telephoto lenses to try and figure out, and they're just intuiting by what they see. Okay, so they're moving that piece over there, so that's going to go on the launch tower. Ooh, there's the booster for the first stage of the Starship. So the news we're getting is largely from them. So it's leaks. So it's very different, but in a way it's much more democratic and kind of organic. And I kind of love it, because it's people really, mostly young people, really putting their backs into it and saying, I'm going to sleuth this out. So instead of wasting our time on we never landed on the moon conspiracies or being flat earthers or whatever, we can spend our energies trying to figure out what's really going on, whether they tell us or not. And I like that.
Yeah, it's awesome. It'd be cool if you could do the same thing with like SLS and Orion, but like you said, you don't have that same level of ability to observe.
Well, in that case, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's two faceted. So on the one hand, it's NASA and their contractors, so they have to have a certain amount of transparency because it's required. But in that, so for instance, as a journalist, I'm the editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine, right? And I work a lot with space.com. So up until recently, we had pretty ready access to NASA events. You just went from field center to field center, whether it was Kennedy or Johnson or Wallops or whatever, you dealt with their press people and you either got in or you didn't. Um, Now, just recently, in the last couple of weeks, they've consolidated everything so that it all matches. So from headquarters on down through all the field centers, including JPL, they now have this one set of requirements for you to get in. So if you're social media, you're going to have a harder time than if you're a print magazine like mine. If you're a print magazine like mine, you have a harder time than if you're a TV or radio network. So it's become a little more striated. And I think we're going to find it harder to get to these events, which isn't to say we won't get the news because it'll get out there. We're just going to be kind of on the long end of the pipeline. And by the time you hear it, you're getting it filtered by somebody else. We don't like that. We want to be there ourselves. On the other hand, if you're dealing with SpaceX or Blue Origin or one of those places, then you're dealing with their public relations department, and that's, as long as you can get in, that's great. That's fun.
Yeah, I mean, I especially like what NASA's been doing with social as well. Providing kind of like people who aren't like space reporters who have like all these big kind of followings in completely unrelated areas, and they're able to kind of uh, help to spread around space. Because, like you mentioned about news back in 1969, whenever we went to the moon, you didn't have customized news. You saw the same thing everybody else did, or you
Yeah.
didn't see anything. Today, people live in bubbles that are of the creation negotiated between them and the platforms they use
And the algorithms.
and the algorithms, right?
Yeah. Because we're
So
told what they think we want us to hear, right? Which is kind of frustrating. Now, I will say, back in the day, as wonderful as it was, by the time Apollo 14 came around, so we had landed with 11, we had landed with 12, we had the emergency on 13, which got a lot of press coverage. By the time the Apollo 14 astronauts were halfway through their first moonwalk, and I was staying home from school watching all of these things, the networks cut away. They said, okay, the astronauts are heading up to Cone Crater. Now we go back to our regularly scheduled programming. And literally, they went to soap operas and I Love Lucy reruns instead of showing human beings exploring the moon at great taxpayers' expense. I just went nuts. I was so upset. Not because I was staying home from school for that, but because I wanted to see it. And it just drove me absolutely mad. To speak to your social media comment, I will say I work at Jet Propulsion Laboratory as a contractor off and on. And I have to say, I think they really led the charge on the whole social media and the better utilization media thing. NASA's not a fast learner in those areas generally. And it's understandable. They're a big organization, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of rules. But in 1990-ish, a gentleman named Blaine Baggett, who was a producer for public broadcasting and had done a number of series on spaceflight for PBS, went to JPL to run their new media department. And he really shook things up. And I think as a direct result of that, there was more transparency. Their website that came online, I mean, it'd been online for a while, but it really got rejuvenated right after Mars Pathfinder because their servers were literally crashed about 3 times because so many people wanted to see this online. They said, aha, this is a big deal. We got to take this whole internet Netscape 3 thing seriously. And they redesigned how they did business. And that's when you started seeing things like the Mars exploration rover Spirit and Opportunity having social media accounts that were them talking to you and so forth. And that was really a revolution in communication for them because now you're talking one-to-one with people. Instead of this one message that goes to everybody, you're tailoring it for individual groups and little facets of the audience. And I think it was just brilliant. A lot of that credit goes to him.
that's awesome to see somebody that can see the future and take changes. Um, let's see. I also ask what people think about us going back to the moon, and I know Oh, and I see we're just at time. I want to be respectful of your time.
No problem.
How much time do you have?
I'm supposed to be talking to a French television station now, but they haven't called yet. So let's see, have they? No, they haven't called yet. So let's go ahead and go a little longer. And then when they call, I'll call them back.
Okay, sounds good. Um, well, I wanted to ask if it was safe and affordable, would you go to space?
That's a really good question. I get asked that a lot. Many years ago, I was at a museum. I forget which one. I think it was the Kansas Cosmosphere, which is a great place. It's in this little town called Hutchinson. So most people don't go there, but it's the best space museum you've never heard of. It's got fantastic exhibits. And then behind the main museum, they have this huge warehouse filled with some of the best paraphernalia outside of the Smithsonian, especially Soviet era stuff. And I got to sit inside, I think it was there, a Gemini capsule. And they said, okay. And they put the hatch down. Now, a Gemini capsule, this is from the mid 60s. When you were sitting next to the other astronaut in your suits, your shoulders were just about touching. And those guys stayed in there for 2 weeks without opening the hatches at their longest flights. Well, that hatch went down. They left the other one open, but just that one hatch went down. I broke into a cold sweat. About 30 seconds later, I said, this was great. Get me out of here. And so I'm the guy that gets a little sweaty if the elevator takes too long between floors. So I don't think I'm a good candidate for space flight, unless it's in Starship. I do that. That said, from what I've seen of the New Shepard capsule, I think that would be a blast. I mean, we're about to see, as you know, we're about to see Virgin Galactic fly their rocket plane up to near orbit, sort of suborbital heights, with Richard Branson on board. That's going to be like a high altitude jet airplane flight in a private jet, like a Learjet or something. I think if I had a choice and $250,000 to blow, I'd do Blue Origin because it's a rocket. And I'm old school and I want to be in a rocket. I've always wanted to be in a rocket. And that capsule's pretty big. It's only a 7-minute flight. You got a great big window. So you've got this illusion of I can get out if something goes wrong. So I do that in a heartbeat. So yeah, if you guys want to put together 250K, I'm there.
And plus, on top of that, Blue Origin's 100% reusable. You know, it's liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, whereas they had to completely replace the solid rocket engine on uh, on the Virgin Galactic one. So that,
I guess that's true. It's hybrid, isn't it? Virgin Galactic?
yeah, and it's some type of oh, it's like a hybrid
I think it's a
engine.
solid fuel with an oxidizer spray, if I remember
Oh, okay.
correctly. But yeah, there's probably a little more, but that's modular, you know, so they really have figured it out because that thing was designed from the beginning. I mean, you know, I think Branson got kind of a raw deal because when Burt Rutan won the 2004 X Prize, you know, the design was, okay, this thing's got to go up, I think, twice in a week or something like that. And he did, and it was designed to do that. It wasn't designed to become a routine commercially operated space plane. Branson bought it and tried to make it that. And as you've seen, you know, he was projecting flights in 2007. Here it is 2021, and they're just getting around to it. So there's a lot of work to do to redesign that to be robust enough to do that. Bezos, who founded Blue Origin in 2000, has been kind of plodding away at the New Shepard. And of course, he builds the larger rocket engines. He's working on the New Glenn, the big booster. But he's really been kind of chipping away at the New Glenn thing, the New Shepard rocket for a number of years. From the beginning, built to be quickly recyclable. So basically you fly it, you land it, you clean out the ashtrays and add gas and off you go again, you know, metaphorically speaking. So they have the benefit of that from the very beginning in terms of their design. I think what I fear more than anything, and I almost hate to bring it up, but it's got to be talked about, is some point in this process is going to be a flight failure, you know, and people are probably going to die. New Shepard's got arguably a better chance of recovering from a flight emergency than Virgin Galactic, depending on which point of their flight they're in when it happens. But at some point, some civilians are probably going to die. And that's just part of the deal. And you will sign a disclaimer before you go. And if it happens, we're very sorry, but we don't owe you any money because you signed a disclaimer. Attorneys spend a lot of time figuring out how to punch through disclaimers. So there'll be some lawsuits. The FAA will get involved. They'll tighten rules up again. So there's going to be some obstacles here, but ultimately it's the only way forward. Space tourism is still a question mark to me. I don't know how many people. We've got a small supply of high-end millionaires who can go and want to go. Will they want to fly 5 times? Probably not. They might fly twice. So it's not like going to the south of France every year, you know? So we'll see how robust a business that is. But as that rolls into, both Blue Origin and Virgin have research deals with NASA for brief microgravity experiments. And of course, SpaceX has all kinds of deals going with NASA, and so will Blue and others. So I think that conglomeration of, sorry, that call just came in, of both tourism and straight commercial operations to fulfill NASA and other space agency requirements are really going to be what picks up the pace. There's sort of, when I wrote Space Point 2.0, I had this Venn diagram in mind, which was 3 circles: NASA, international space agencies, and the private sector. And where those 3 overlap is where the magic happens to me. And at this point, international is tough for us. The only example we've had is the International Space Station, that kind of cooperation. Russia's kind of turning a cold shoulder to us now. They're going to pull out of the space station and work with China. So international will mean Europe and India and a couple of other countries, Japan and China and Russia may go their own way for a while. Ultimately, it would be great if we could sing Kumbaya and all work together. I think that'll take a while. And of course, in the US, we have some legal requirements that prevent us from working specifically with China and other nations along their lines. But if that can happen, between that and the robust private spaceflight community that's forming in the United States with NASA leadership, because NASA has always been the trailblazer in terms of going further, faster. They go to all the dark and scary places until they figure it out, and then other people can follow them, like private industry. If we can get that middle overlapping section to really coordinate well, I think that's when the magic happens, and we'll see things pick up speed very quickly.
It's going to be an exciting time, and
It is.
I really appreciate your time, Rod, and I know we could probably talk for days and days and days.
We could.
So maybe next year at ISDC, we can have a cup of coffee or something.
Yeah, if you're going to come, that'd be great. I go to every one of them, and I usually speak 3 or 4 times and help coordinate a lot of stuff. So I'd love to sit down and chat more. You're not by any chance going to Space Fest this year, are you?
I'm not familiar with it. When is it?
That is next week in Tucson, and it is a combination art show and astronaut sort of autograph show. But they've been diversifying last few years to include science fiction and more talks on space technology in the future and so forth. So it's fun. It's a smaller gathering. It's probably about 600 to 800 people, but they take over a hotel outside of Tucson in the middle of summer, which means slow season, right? Because it's 140 degrees out there. But it's a lot of fun, and it's similar to ISDC in that you get to hang out with people of a common ilk. So if I come home and talk about spaceflight to the family, they're good for about 5 minutes, and it's like, look at the time. I have to go do something. What do you have to do? I have to go wash the dog, anything to get away from me while I'm going on and on about rockets and so forth. But you go to these gatherings, as you've seen at ISDC, and you're talking to like-minded people who want nothing more than to sit down and talk about their favorite parts of this for hours and hours. And it's food for the soul, and it's great fun. And you meet a lot of new friends there, and I love it. So Space Fest is very much that way as well, but it's coming up pretty quick. So if you can make it to ISDC, we are going to hold ISDC physically this year if it kills me. Because for 2021, we had to do virtual, and it was good. I programmed that, but I would really like to get back to physical gatherings because A, it's less work than trying to pre-produce the whole thing, and B, I just miss seeing the people.
Absolutely. It's the side conversations that are essential, and it's hard to do that virtually.
Yeah, I hardly go to any of the talks when I go to those things. I just hang out with people and chat. And it gives me a chance to meet people who want to become writers for Ad Astra, because we're 90% freelance driven. So that's an added bonus. I get a lot of that work there.
That is awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Rod. And if you know any other people willing to talk to me, I have 1,272 more days to get through. But who's counting?
I can probably get you about 200 if you want them.
That'd be great.
So anybody, right?
Anybody, yeah.
They don't have to be astronauts or engineers or what have you.
My plan was to interview people at Starbucks. But whenever COVID happened, I had to kind of go online, and then I had to than anybody. But I think it's a good thing because I see this as being a time capsule for people 100 years from now to look back at kind of what people were thinking before sort of this true space age started.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be all just like random people who have no interest. We should also include people that have a deep interest and are passionate about it as well.
Well, I can get you a couple hundred frothing fanatics in pretty short order, so we'll talk more. It would also be interesting. I don't want to take up another session with you because you've got other people to interview, but it would be interesting to have a discussion at some point about selling the space program. It's always been a tough sell. I think NASA's been out in front of most of the world in terms of trying to get that message out to the public because they had to. If you live in China or Russia, you don't have a choice. They're just going to have a space program and they plan 10 years out. With NASA, it's a political consideration. Congress reshuffles every 2 years. The executive branch shuffles every 4 years. You've got to constantly be selling this stuff. And whether it's robotic or human space flight, it's the same deal. I talked to a lot of people at JPL about their program. I was talking just the other day to somebody who's running the Voyager program, just 40 plus years, right? And they're operating with a crew of about 18 people in an office that isn't even on the JPL campus. It's off in Pasadena somewhere in an old insurance office with a couple of Sun workstations on a banquet table. I mean, I'm not kidding. That's mission control now because Voyager's still sending information back and they got to chat with it to gather that science. They have to resell their program every year. And it's a lot of work, but it'd be interesting to have a broader discussion about that process. What role is played by private industry? How can NASA work better to sell their program? That's not really part of their charter, but they got to do it because they have to keep Congress convinced. How can we convince people that this is important? It's not just about guts and glory and adventure, but it's about good science. That's pretty easy to understand. But the direct benefits to people that come back down to earth that affect us in our everyday lives, not just in terms of commercially available products, which, I mean, here, hello, Apollo program. That phone has more computing power than the entire planet did when Apollo 11 landed, believe it or not. But in terms of the opportunities for young people, if you're a kid growing up in America or Western Europe or even India or some other part of the world, you have opportunities now that you and I could only have dreamed of when we were young. And a lot of that's because of the acceleration of space technology and development exploration. So if you want to have a conversation about that sometime, I think that would be fun.
Yeah, I'd love to. And, just to kind of put some thoughts out there, whenever I talk to people about what they think about space, a lot of them are like, opportunity cost. They have like their issue that they feel isn't getting attention and they just want to take resources from wherever they think it's being misplaced towards that, which I think makes sense from their point of view. And then, a lot of people are just wondering what the point of it all is. But whenever you turn the question to, would you like to go to space? Suddenly they're interested.
Yes.
I think their level of support correlates directly with their level of participation. If they're not actually able to participate, then they don't see any point. And if they are able to participate, they're willing to support it.
Well, I think another way to put that is what's in it for me. And NASA's done some very smart things. I was just interviewing the other day the principal investigator on the Juno mission, Scott Bolton. Great interview, fun guy, very aware of public perception and the role of the arts and everything else, the humanities and what he does. And he worked very hard to put a camera on Juno that could be aimed and utilized by citizen scientists. So you and I could put in our request. And if we were lucky, we'd get a chance to get the shot we wanted of Jupiter and the surrounding areas when they weren't doing their other pre-programmed science. And I think the same thing will happen in the human spaceflight program moving ahead. And that's how you sell it. So yeah, let's have that conversation at some point.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, Rod, and until then, I guess, thank you so much again. And I look
Great
forward
pleasure.
to staying in touch.
See you next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.